Welcome, guys. Mr. Hyatt here. This is the Chapter 9 AP Environmental Science lecture on food, soil, and pest management. We start this chapter with a look at some urban farming setups that, as you see on the screen here, the mission is to provide affordable organic food, particularly in areas of high poverty where there's not a lot of food security. We're going to get to that issue in just a second. But essentially, what we're trying to do is sustainably harvest organic vegetables and herbs and fruit and things like that, and some chickens, turkeys, goats, fish, and certainly honeybees, to people that can't afford, maybe can't afford food, period, but definitely can't afford good food. There are a lot of subsidies for corn and processed foods that lowers the, the subsidies are for corn that lowers the cost of processed foods. So if you go to a gas station, a convenience store, something like that, and you look around, you tend to see a lot of highly preserved, highly processed foods that are essentially corn and high fructose corn syrup. So the goal of some of these urban farming initiatives is to sustainably harvest really healthy food that's going to have lots of nutrients that we can get to those people that are most vulnerable. So think about the question on the screen. Do you know where your food's grown and produced? Most of us, the answer to that question is no. So I mentioned food security. Food security is essentially how secure is your next set of nutrients. It's not necessarily how secure is your next meal, because your next meal might not have the correct nutrients. So it's really broader than just starvation. It could be nutrient malnutrition, things like that. In less developed countries, people tend to suffer from some of that starvation and stuff like that. More developed countries, there are the problems that we see with obesity and overeating and things like that. The slide's got several factors that influence the food supply. If you're really poor, you probably don't have access to a great food supply. If you're fighting a war, you're probably not really concerned with planting vegetables. A tsunami or a flood or something like that can take out whole crops. A drought can take out whole crops. Of course, climate change plays into those things. And then the effects of the industrialized food production kind of work against itself. But getting back to food insecurity, poverty is the root cause. Notice there, 2050 is the kind of the benchmark that our book uses. They're estimating about 9.8 billion people, almost half of which are going to live in poverty and experience food insecurity. So that's pretty scary. Almost 5 billion people living in poverty and don't have a real secure source of their next set of nutrients. So there's a couple definition, or I guess a definition of food insecurity. Again, chronic hunger, poor nutrition, and health problems, typically due to poverty. Now, that's in parentheses because that's not part of the definition. It's just typically that's the root cause. 3 out of 10 people in the world survive on less than $3.10 American a day. That's pretty mind-blowing. Soon we'll start doing some math about how much money you spend per month to charge your cell phone and how much money you spend on your cell phone charger just hanging in the outlet, not doing anything. And I'll bring this data point back up, and some of you will feel kind of badly about yourself. But that's not the goal, but it is something to keep in mind. So on this slide, we've got an important definition of hunger. Hungry doesn't mean I just ate 20 minutes ago and I could really go for a taco. That's not what hungry means. Hungry is when you don't have enough food to meet your basic energy needs. If you ate 20 minutes ago, you got enough food to meet your basic energy needs. Chronic malnutrition is going to be hunger over a long amount of time. In low-income, less developed countries, we tend to see diets that are high in carbs but low in proteins because meat is really expensive and it's hard to grow. In more developed countries, we see a lot of fats, sugars, and salts, and again, little protein, because still that's an expensive thing. If you think about folks that are in poverty in more developed countries, you're talking about typically people in inner cities. Not exclusively. There's certainly poverty in the country as well. But people that are poor here in the United States are going to do a lot of their shopping at places like convenience stores. And even if they shop at the same grocery store that anyone who's not in poverty shops at, they can't afford $6 for some really nice organic vegetable. They can't afford, apples and oranges and things like that. There are food deserts in more developed countries. That's something we'll look at later, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here in today's lecture. Some 2 billion people suffer from vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So think about why you eat what you eat. You're not eating Brussels sprouts and beets because they give you the nutrients that you need. You eat those things because you like them or you don't like them. And that's kind of an issue. We need to shift that perspective. We need to shift our perspective from getting satisfaction from our food to surviving because of our food. We don't need to enjoy what we eat. We just need to eat and survive and do other things. We see overnutrition here in the U.S. a lot. That's overeating and things like that. 72% of our adults are overweight. Think about what that leads to in terms of blood pressure. I just saw a news story today that said something like half of American adults suffer from high blood pressure. So you can't act like those two things aren't connected. If 72% of adults are overweight, there's probably a really good chance that the half of the adults that have high blood pressure are probably these same people. Of course, you're going to have issues with blood pressure and heart disease and strokes and diabetes, all kinds of issues. So it's an issue that derives from this content. So how do we improve food security? We can create subsidies to support and improve food production. We can create subsidies for urban farms, things like that. We can end subsidies to things like corn and beans that don't contribute to really high nutrient-rich foods. We can do private and public programs to reduce and eliminate poverty. That's oftentimes easier said than done. We, of course, need to teach better eating habits, and we need to teach more sustainable food production. We need to take a look at what it takes to create that hamburger that we love to eat so much, and really truthfully have an honest conversation about if it's worth it. We need to assess our risk better. We need to look at what we're doing to the environment, and we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to look at what we're doing and look at the impacts that we're making on the planet, and we got to figure out, is this really worth it, or is this just the way that things have always been done, so we're going to keep doing it? Section 9.2 is all about how food is produced. I'm intentionally skipping this section for our lecture because most of this you guys covered in your jigsaws, so I'm putting a little bit of that responsibility back onto you guys. You do have a link to the PowerPoint or the Google Slides presentation, so I would make sure that you're familiar with everything up through slide 18. All of this. This is the last slide in this section before we move on to talking about topsoil. So if you didn't get anything from the jigsaws or anything from the jigsaws didn't make sense and you want some more information, there's information here. Go look for it. If you need help, by all means, don't hesitate to ask. But that's part 1 of chapter 9. We will pick up in part 2 talking about topsoil.